Sorry about that. I have some rocks that I use from to keep the phone in place sideways so I can film myself. So one rock from Giza, from next to the Great Pyramid. One rock is from Abu Simbel, which is like an ancient Egyptian site near the Sudanese border that I almost got lost in a month ago. And the other rock was given to me by some people in the Valley of the Kings in Upper Egypt. So anyway, I kind of use them all three to keep the phone from falling over, but it doesn't always work. Anyway, happy St. Patrick's Day. Happy St. Patty's Day. It's I'm not wearing green, but I don't have. Let's see, am I wearing green? I don't know. But I mean, red is basically the same as green, because green is not like, it was not like the national color of Ireland or anything like that. Like, the reason green became kind of the national color of Ireland was because it was the international color of revolution, just like red is. And so the Irish, because they were trying to, revolt and overthrow the British and whatever, they adopted green as their color. I think the Levelers might have worn green in Britain in the 1600s, and the French revolutionaries wore green before they came up with the tricolor, and most of the Irish nationalists in the 1790s were promoters of the French Revolution, admirers of at least aspects of the French Revolution, certainly the initial principles of the French Revolution. So they wore green, it was an international symbol of revolution and hope. And so, yeah, it's not, it's sad how Irish nationalism, which was originally actually very internationalist, has, it ultimately became kind of more like a typical nationalism, where it was like an ethnic squabble. But in the early days of Irish nationalism, like the first Irish nationalists were British Protestants, ancestrally British, because the Irish, for the most part, the Irish were not nationalists before that. Like, the Irish fought against, some of the Protestant leaders in Britain and whatever, but ultimately they tended to be loyal to the Stuarts. They wanted the Stuart kings to come back and rule the British Isles. So the idea of Ireland just being totally separate from Britain, mostly died out by the I don't know. Well, at least by the late 1600s, I think it had largely died out. And so it was in the late 1700s that it was revived primarily by Presbyterians in the north, Scotch-Irish, Ulster Scots Presbyterians. And, they're like half the Presbyterian population had moved to America. The Presbyterians had been the majority population in Ulster. but something like 250,000 of them moved to America during the 1700s, and then they were like the leaders of the American Revolution. So they helped inspire the Ulster Scots Presbyterians who had stayed back in Ulster. They helped inspire them with this kind of, anti-British, independent spirit. And so they wanted independence for Ireland. And, they were called the United Irishmen. I mean, they kind of came out of the Irish volunteer movement of the 1780s, which was directly connected to the American Revolution. It was actually founded based on, like, the Irish Volunteers were founded based on the pretext of that France had joined the war against, France had joined the American side in the Revolution. And so there was at least the distant possibility that the French might attack, the British Isles. And so they're based on that pretext. And actually, I think there was a French ship that almost either almost attacked or was at least seen near the Irish coast, in like County Antrim or Londonderry or something. And so that was the original impetus for the volunteers to basically form militias, start arming, start drilling throughout the north, and then it later, eventually spread through the rest of Ireland. But even though ostensibly they were arming to, fight off the Americans' allies, the French, they were actually, for the most part, they supported the Americans. And then when the French Revolution occurred, they supported that. So they were very ecumenical, whereas nowadays the left is so much like radicalism, so much just about identity and like, okay, there's these groups that are inherently evil, and then there's these other groups that are like inherently good and divine and whatever. Like, that's nowadays a lot of the left is unfortunately like that. Like, they will deify somebody based on their identity, and they will demonize somebody based on their identity. But these United Irishmen, like, they weren't Irish in their blood. Like, they had been in Ireland. They had come to Ireland from Scotland during the 1600s. So they had been in Ireland for, at least 100 years by the 1790s. And they, they were patriots for Ireland. And they wanted to join together with the Catholic and Episcopal and, Anglican and Methodist and other people in Ireland to assert their rights, because they knew otherwise, like, they're always going to be second fiddle to Britain. They're always going to be used by Britain. So, actually, they helped create the United Kingdom, very directly. Like, without the United Irishmen, the UK, like the Union Jack as we know it, probably wouldn't exist, because like the Union Jack before, like in the 1700s, it looked different, because the Union Jack is like the British flag is the blue Scottish flag, the blue saltire, and the red St. George's cross. And then, but it was only after, it was only in the 1800s that they added the Irish X as well, the red, St. Patrick's cross. So, and that was a direct result of the fact that, like, these United Irishmen had risen up, and I mean, it was like the American Revolution, but I would say maybe Britain, because they didn't want to lose Ireland the way they lost America, they kind of gave in to the demands in a sense, and they gave the Irish, because they would say, like, there's no taxation without representation, right? So they gave them representation in the British Parliament. They basically folded the Irish and British parliaments into each other, just as they had folded the Scottish and English parliaments into each other in the early 1600s. Or was it? No, not the early 1600s. In the early 1700s, sorry. That was the Act of Union between England and Scotland. So, green to me is very sacred, like, and everything about the United Irishmen. I mean, they were flawed people, they weren't perfect at all. Like, it took a while for them to embrace manhood suffrage, to basically allow all men to vote, to promote basically what was called democracy at the time, which meant that poor people were allowed to vote. And, in the beginning, some of the even United Irish leaders were a bit aristocratic and were reluctant to promote that, but eventually they realized that was the way that the movement was going, and they became a pretty radical movement, and they had a huge influence on the U.S. because they, just the existence of the United Irish movement was a great inspiration to the U.S. Because the Ulster Scots were basically like the second largest population in the U.S. Maybe kind of tied with Germans and Africans, but yeah, like they were among, like, and the fact that they were basically English speaking, they spoke a different dialect of English, you could say. They spoke like Ulster Scots, but it was from kind of the same Anglo-Saxon roots. So they, in some ways, they were more prominent than the Germans. The Germans tended to speak German and keep to themselves and their communities and whatever, whereas the Ulster Scots were more of a factor within the broader British American society. And they largely constituted the proto-left in America, like the early radicals. And they helped inspire the United Irishmen back home, and they were in turn inspired by the United Irishmen. And then when the United Irish Rebellion of 1798 was suppressed, then the United Irishmen fled to America, like in their thousands. And, some people said that it was the largest and most respectable migration, it's like the biggest chunk of like literate, like the most educated migration basically that had ever come to America, because the Presbyterians were highly literate, both in Scotland, or in Britain and in Ireland. And at that time, the Scottish universities, which many of them attended, were considered to be the best universities in the world, Glasgow and Edinburgh in particular. So, like Edinburgh was like the leading medical school in the world. Glasgow was leading, it was like Adam Smith was promoting, attacking mercantilism basically in Glasgow. So anyway, in America, when these exiles, a lot of them went back actually to Britain. A lot of the United Irish went to Scotland and to Northern England, to like Liverpool and Manchester, to Glasgow, throughout Scotland, throughout Northern England, especially southwest Scotland, which is where they had largely come from originally before they had gone to Ireland. But a lot of them also went to America, and they played a big role in Jefferson's campaign and helping him achieve victory over Adams in 1801 or whatever. Like John Wayne was actually descended from these radical exiles, ironically enough, since he was kind of like a right-wing icon himself. But what can you do? And also Woodrow Wilson was also descended from them. I think he was descended from a radical exile who was a newspaper man. And again, he, for the most part, you could say that Woodrow Wilson was right-wing. He certainly was very problematic person, but I guess it could be that the United Nations, the League of Nations and all that comes from, that he derived that from his kind of radical heritage, that the radicalism of his heritage actually might have shown through in that. It's hard to know. But anyway, like, to me, green represents those people who were, it wasn't this thing of like, oh yeah, we're the Irish and we hate the English and we want them all dead kind of thing. It was like, he was like these people were British, they lived in Ireland, but they believed in Ireland, they believed in their neighbors, and they wanted to, unite with their neighbors, and end sectarianism and religious persecution of Catholics and Presbyterians. But, to the extent that they were fighting for Catholics, which to a large extent they were, because Catholics were the most oppressed people in Ireland, I think it puts them kind of on the level of some of the like abolitionists of in 1800s America, people who like fought and put their lives on the line to help demographics that they were in no way a part of. Turn on some light here. All right. Night and day. So, yeah, like I just give them extra points for that, for the fact that they were fighting for somebody else besides just themselves, because, it's good for people to fight for themselves, like, if like the original kind of Irish nationalists of like the 1500s trying to fight off the English, that's good. They should have that they they did as they should have done, but it's just not. It's just even better if you can show that you're not just fighting for yourself, but you're fighting for other people. And that to me is what green symbolizes. It's what the United Irishmen symbolize. Another reason that green probably became the color of Ireland was one of the United Irishmen, kind of the founder of the United Irishmen, arguably, an Ulster Scots poet named William Drennan. His father had been, I believe his father had been like very close, maybe best friends with Francis Hutcheson, who was the radical, liberal professor of moral philosophy at Glasgow University, who was Adam Smith's teacher and inculcated a lot of the more radical elements in Smith's thought. And also was, Francis Hutcheson was arguably or potentially the major impetus or like philosophical inspiration behind the American Revolution, because he had basically written in favor of an American Revolution back in like 1740. And then his student, Adam Smith, wrote even more explicitly in favor of it in 1776. And then Adam Smith was basically Francis Hutcheson's most important pupil. And Adam Smith's most important pupil would probably be John Millar. Like that was a succession at Glasgow University in the chair of moral philosophy. Like the chair of moral philosophy was held by Hutcheson, then Adam Smith, then John Millar, and I'm not sure who was after John Millar, but John Millar, basically, those three were like the flag bearers of radicalism in Scotland. They supported the American Revolution. They supported the French Revolution. I mean, John Millar basically supported the French Revolution. And then John Millar's, one of his most important pupils were James Milne, who anglicized his name to Mill, whose son, John Stuart Mill, who was probably his most important influence. And sorry. But, and I think through that conduit, through that legacy, I think Karl Marx was formed, his philosophy was formed in many ways through that same legacy, because, he was a close student of Adam Smith and utilitarians, James and John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham, all three of whom basically were following Francis Hutcheson and like Francis Hutcheson, so he was like the early 1700s. His most famous like motto was the greatest happiness of the greatest numbers of people, or different variations on that, the greatest happiness of the greatest number. And then that became the motto of the utilitarians of Jeremy Bentham, James Mill, John Stuart Mill. But his pupil, John Millar, like Hutcheson was also very feminist, you could say, like proto-feminist. He, was argued strongly in favor of treating women well, treating women with respect, and that was like a sign of civilized society. And his pupil, John Millar, took that further and made it the centerpiece of his philosophy. Basically, that the idea that all cultures can be graded basically according to on their level of civilization based on how they treat women. And that was the basis of James Mill. I think James Mill was his actual student at Glasgow, either at Glasgow or at Edinburgh. And that became the centerpiece of James Mill's most important work. He was one of the two leading original kind of utilitarians, Jeremy Bentham and James Mill, and he wrote a history of India that used that premise. And I think John Stuart Mill also carried on that same feminism. And I think that's somehow that's the trajectory by which Karl Marx, arrived at that same position, basically that you can judge societies on their level of civilization by how they treat women, because it's a pretty specific thesis in a way, and he stated it very very strongly, succinctly, and very almost verbatim, the same way that it was stated by James Mill and John Millar. So in that sense, I consider Karl Marx to be a Millarist. He certainly always said he was not a Marxist. And I think in general, like, nobody should be an anythingist. Everybody should think for themselves on every issue. But on that issue, I think he was a Millarist. So anyway, Francis Hutcheson, who had taught Adam Smith, who had taught John Millar, who had taught James Mill, who had taught John Stuart Mill, who had influenced Karl Marx, had himself been highly influenced by the Earl of Shaftesbury, who was the founder. I guess it was like this. He was influenced by the philosopher, the Earl of Shaftesbury, in around the turn of that century, like around the year 1700, whatever. Or maybe later, 1710s or 20s, who was the son of the Earl of Shaftesbury, who had founded liberalism, like founded the Liberal Party in England, or the Whig Party as it was known. It was named after the Scottish Whigs, who were in some ways the real founders of it, who themselves were largely founded by Ulster Scots who had gone back and forth between the Irish Channel, escaping the authorities and causing trouble for the authorities. Anyway, it was Francis Hutcheson's, possibly his best friend, certainly one of his best friends, one of his main pen pals, I guess, Thomas Drennan, who was the father of William Drennan, the founder of the United Irishmen. And Hutcheson, by the way, Hutcheson was the chair of the Glasgow University, chair of moral philosophy, or Department of Moral Philosophy. But he was not from Scotland. He was born in Ulster. He was an Ulster Scot himself. So, and I think he was a bit of a hybrid. So he was a bit partly Anglo-Irish as well. So a mix of kind of Scottish, Ulster Scot and Anglo-Irish, Presbyterian. And, because I think at the end of the Commonwealth periods, a lot of the English dissenters or English Puritans, basically, like the non-churchmen, the non-Anglicans, a lot of them probably married in with the Ulster Scots, because the Ulster Scots were a larger community that, at least had some hope of persisting there even under a Catholic government, which, or an Anglican, I guess, Anglican government under the the restoration of the crown. So Drennan, William Drennan, he was a poet. He founded the United Irishmen, and one of his famous poems, I'm not sure if it's what the name of it is, but I know that the term Emerald Isle, like referring to Ireland as an Emerald Isle, is from one of his poems. So along with the fact that the United Irishmen started wearing green as their French comrades were doing at the same time, and then his poem about the Emerald Isle, I think those two things led to green becoming the Irish color, quote unquote. So it's not a narrow nationalist thing at all. It's not like, oh, you have to be Irish to wear it at all. Like the Irish took it from, it was just an international color. It's like red. Like I wear red because I'm a communist. And red, was not even a communist color back in the day. It was the same as green. It could stand for basically socialists. It could stand for even probably liberal constitutionalists, as long as they were kind of, revolutionary, anti-establishment. Red was like a normal color to rally under, and green was as well. And the green also related to the I think it tied in with the Tree of Liberty motif, which was an important meme in early radicalism in America and in Europe. The probably red comes from the Frisian cap, like the Liberty cap. One of the main kind of radical revolutionary motifs that you would see in those times, a symbol, either a painting or even the real thing, would be a tree of liberty, and with a red Phrygian cap on top of it. So I'm not sure exactly how the Phrygian cap became the liberty cap. I mean, I think the Phrygians are, they're maybe around where the Kosovars are or something, or I don't know, they're somewhere maybe in that area of the northeast Mediterranean. But yeah, so I think red and green to some extent come from that, because I mean the tree of liberty, a lot of times there would be trees of liberty that would be poles, or they would set up poles to be like liberty poles, which is basically the same as a maypole, and it was often on May 1st. So it may have derived from earlier traditions, like possibly non-political, like even pagan traditions. But this idea of the tree of liberty was just a very strong meme in those times. Like one of the most important United Irish, sayings, I guess they call it a catechism, something that they would say, maybe a way to find out if somebody was truly an initiated member. So you would say like, what have you there? And then they would answer, I have a green bough or something, and then they say, where did you find this green bough? I found it, or where did this green bough first grow? And then they say, in America. And then they say, where did it blossom or something? And then they say, in France. And then they say, and where are you going to plant it? And they say, in the crown of Great Britain. So it's basically saying like, liberty is gaining strength first in America, then in France, and then they want to basically make it the order of the day in the British Isles as well. And it just shows like how central, I mean, America really did create the modern left, like modern leftists. I mean, that's part of why the modern left is so insane, because it hates its own origins, like there's nothing that the modern left hates more than America, basically. Although maybe you could say that the people who are really, really pushing the dogmatically anti-American narrative are the ones who are trying to sabotage the left. Like if we can be severed from our own roots, if we can be made to hate all of our own heritage as leftists, then it's just another little nudge to get us to all hate ourselves and each other and just give up. So anyway, that's a little about green and Ireland and America. Another tidbit, if it's not going to cut me off here, is that the first St. Patrick's Day, or like St. Patrick's Day as we know it, is largely like an expat thing. It was, I think the first St. Patrick's Society was founded in America, like maybe in Boston in like the 1718 or something like that. And then there were societies founded in New York and Philadelphia. And so these St. Patrick's societies were, and sometimes Hibernian societies and stuff like that, were gathering places for all like Irish expats, which in America at that time meant mostly Presbyterians, but also some Anglicans and some Catholics. So they were the ones who started the